In any event, I want to welcome you to our lecture this evening on a rather cold night, reminding me that winter is approaching. But before we introduce our lecturer, Vishaan Chakrabarti, I would like to make the following comments. As all of you, most of you at least know, I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture and Design at NYIT's School of Architecture. And the following comments are, including me when I sit down, please turn off your cell phones. And second, as stated on our invitation, we are AIA CES registered providers. So at the end of the lecture, please make sure to sign on the appropriate form. Is this still working? Yes, the appropriate form so that you can get your continuing education credits. AIA members, please provide Jennifer Mitchell with your membership number, and registered architects, I think it's a separate form. Tonight's event is the final event in our fall lecture series. In fact, Vishaan was supposed to lecture for us in the spring, and we had some kind of storm or some weather-related cancellation. So we thank you for coming this fall. In any event, I would like to thank Jennifer Mitchell, our special events coordinator, for organizing this, helping organize this event, and Steelcase as well for always their wonderful hospitality and their technical assistance. And tonight, our speaker, Vishaan Chakrabarti's lecture is A Country of Cities, and I will ask Robert Rockwell to come on the stage to make the introduction. And Robert is one of our long-standing adjuncts who's been teaching for us. He's not teaching this semester, I regret to say, but we are loyal and we're glad to have you make the introduction. Thank you.
I'm mic'd already, so I can thank you, Judy. Tonight we're pleased to have a well-known urbanist, Vishaan Chakrabarti, speak about cities and their culture as it relates to the American landscape. We missed him last February, as Judy explained. It was due to snow, actually, I think, right? Yeah. As he puts forward in A Country of Cities, a healthy city is an equitable city and relies on several factors, none more essential than affordable housing. It's no mystery, it and its design are constants in our own architectural education here at NYIT. Mayor de Blasio's vision for New York foregrounds housing as well, and is underscored by his 10-year housing plan to build and preserve 200,000 units of affordable housing that will be a central pillar in the battle against inequality. This will likely encourage hyperdense development, a term repeated in the book and critical to a sustainable metropolis. One example of a personal kind worth mentioning is the amalgamated dwellings familiar to Vishaan and to all the third-year students I'm staring at tonight, who have both had the opportunity to visit and study it. This quintessentially urban infrastructure exemplifies quality, affordability, and resiliency. With 164 units per acre, it anchors Grand Street with a brand of symbolic and socialistic workers' housing aesthetic and evokes an uber-urban yet bucolic architecture. Developed privately to establish quality without profit as its objective, it was dedicated to retaining local workers plagued by excessive rental increases on the Lower East Side. Its resiliency was proven during Hurricane Sandy with naturally lit public stairs and an accessible 6-story construction, or running water height, as I like to say. Tenants' comfort further bolstered during the 5-day power outage by a supportive community of elderly and young families in close proximity, epitomizing an urban lifestyle under extreme conditions. It's relevant due to its proximity to the Seward Park urban renewal area, or Essex Crossing, as it will be known, being master planned by Vishaan and his firm Shop Architects. Their plan will transform a rare and vacant spot of Manhattan, forlorn for 40 years, with a diverse use structure with significant affordable housing occupying much of its massing. Essex Crossing must also integrate the hectic Williamsburg Bridge access at the termination of Delancey Street, sporadic public housing towers, the cooperatives of Grand Street, amalgamated included in that, and the original low-rise tenement fabric, which has weathered urban renewal and political wrangling of an extraordinary dimension. These intersections of development, architecture, and lifestyle are integral to Vishaan's ethics, clearly captured in a country of cities with an abundance of graphical diagrams and theoretical arguments, making it a spirited manifesto to the urban. They are the same issues we ask our students to contemplate in their small and large projects, in their technical education, and their thinking as architects, establishing concepts appropriate for a city, envisioning viable housing infrastructures, and seeing design as a contributing factor to our city. His consistent and passionate voice in planning, development, practice, and education is distinct in the fray of the 21st century metropolis, where we must advocate and demonstrate resolve in realizing this incredible project of the city. Please welcome Vishaan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, William. Thank you, Judy, for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to be here when it is not snowing outside. I remember that day, actually. So what I wanted to talk to you about, and forgive me, I'm going to have to say next because we had a clicker problem. So I'm not necessarily always talking about the future. I'm just asking for the next slide. What I wanted to talk about is really, so the book that William mentioned came out a couple of years ago. And what I've really been fascinated by at a national and an international level is when the book came out, it came out not alone, but actually with a series of other books and other literature that were being written about the strength of cities, the economic strength of cities. Actually, we could go to the next slide, please. About the economic strength of cities, the ability for cities to be actually a truly significant solution to climate change, the strength of cities as a platform for social change, not just in terms of affordable housing and other issues which we'll discuss, but also in terms of, I mean, if you look at the Arab Spring, for instance, when you saw those protests taking place around the world, you noticed that they weren't taking place in the deserts of Egypt. They were taking place in the heart of the cities of the Arab world. And so one could argue, in fact, that countries would not experience social change without cities forming the sort of hardware platform for social change. So what's interesting is a couple of years ago when the book came out, and again, I think very much with a series of other pieces that came out at the same time, there were people writing and thinking about, well, could cities be the silver bullet in terms of many of the problems that society faces today? What I've noticed in the last couple of years is that the conversation has moved from whether cities can do this, but to how cities can do this. In other words, I've noticed, for all of the sort of pessimism we have in our national politics, as we think about all the very tough things that are going on internationally, at the city level, mayors are doing extraordinary things. There's a tremendous grassroots movement, I believe, around the idea of cities as this kind of catalyst for change. So this is an image from the book that's trying to think about a city that doesn't actually exist. It's not an image of New York or London or Tokyo. It's an idyllic city in which we could achieve a lot of the things that William talked about in his introduction in terms of the equitable city, the environmental city, the social city. Next slide, please. And at the end of the book, kind of to jump a bit, what the book tries to unpack is the idea that, and you're all designers, and so you can envision things that are sometimes harder for other people to envision. And one of the things I would ask you to think about is, if you step back 100 years in time and walked around this country, the landscape would fundamentally be very different. It was actually a much denser landscape, much more, most cities in the United States actually were far denser at the, say, about 1910, 1915 than they are today. Most of the natural environment in the country was actually unspoiled. And what we did systematically with an enormous acceleration after World War II is we intervened in the marketplace. We intervened in people's choices, especially the middle class's choices, in terms of how we should live, work, and play. And so one of the things the book tries to do is unpack that intervention. And that intervention is extraordinary, and it happens at the level primarily of the federal government, but also local government, in terms of the degree to which we have subsidized the suburbs. We spend 4 times as much on roads as we do on rail. We do this thing called the mortgage interest deduction, which primarily fuels suburban home growth to the tune of about $100 billion a year. So for those of you who think that the government doesn't spend money on housing, it actually does spend money on housing. It's the biggest expenditure we have. It just spends that money primarily on middle-class suburban home buyers who buy bigger homes with the mortgage interest deduction. If you're a condo buyer in the city, you can use that as well, but if you look at the numbers, the vast majority of it goes to the suburbs. And then there's fossil fuel subsidies. You can go on and on down the list. So even if you are the most hardcore believer in the marketplace, we have intervened in the marketplace to create the landscape that we have today, which is largely a failing landscape. If you look at where most of the economic and social failure is in the country, it isn't so much happening in our cities, it's happening in our suburbs, and especially in our exurbs, and a lot of the stuff that was, again, fueled by federal intervention with subprime mortgages at the beginning of this century. So this diagram that's called the whole enchilada is in the back of the book, and what it talks about is the idea that if you took all of those subsidies and instead unpacked them and put about half towards the deficit and the other half towards a new piece of legislation that the book imagines called the American Smart Infrastructure Act, or ASIA for short, that if we actually took all that money and invested in our cities the way our competitors are doing across the world, in terms of great public school systems, affordable housing, great mass transit, great parks, great culture, built what I like to call an infrastructure of opportunity, that we would not only have great prosperous cities that were more equitable cities, but we would also actually start hitting our bottom line in a much better way and start creating prosperity, environmental sustainability, and social mobility. And I really do believe that people are starting to, at the local level at least, understand the power of cities to deliver all of this. At the federal level, it's a far trickier affair, and somehow the last election that we just went through does not warm my hearts to the idea that Asia is going to pass anytime soon. But I do believe that we are trending towards a more urban country and a more urban world, which I'll talk about in a second. Next, please. And then I think, especially for the younger generation in the room, to me, the most critical of all of these crises is climate change. It is an existential crisis. And there is, I think, very little doubt if you look at the data about what to do about this at scale, which is, this notion, we have this idea that we're going to buy our way out of this problem. And what I mean by that is we're going to take this 20th century technology of the suburb, and we're going to slap a windmill on it and a photovoltaic cell on it and plug in the electric car. The electric car is one of my favorites. In the Northeast, when you buy an electric car and plug it in, what you're doing is you're transferring your tailpipe emissions to a coal-fired power plant. So you've actually made the environment worse, but you got to feel better about yourself, and you got to buy something. And after all, we're Americans. We like to buy things. But the reality is we're not going to find just some technological panacea to this problem. We have to think about our lifestyle, and I think we have to think about our lifestyle in a way that isn't filled with kind of eat your spinach mandates. In other words, I think it's going to be very hard to convince people that they have to change their lifestyle if it's not a lifestyle that they ultimately want to gravitate towards for themselves and their family. And so what the book describes is that instead of this landscape of houses and highways and hedges, that if we moved into a much more compact way of living, that had to do with towers and trains and trees, if we primarily moved around by train, if we primarily lived in apartments that heat and cool each other, if you've lived in a house or designed a house, you'll understand that a single family house is a terrible thermal envelope. When you visit someone for Thanksgiving or Christmas in someone's house up in Connecticut or anywhere really in a cold climate, and you notice that you're really cold when you wake up in the morning, that's because all of the heat has escaped through the roof. That's a fundamental flaw to this idea of the single-family house. And so apartments, incredibly thermally efficient. And so what you find is the average New Yorker actually uses a third less energy than the average American, not because we bought a special brand of light bulb or a special brand of floor cleaner, but simply because we use mass transit and live in apartments that heat and cool each other. And to me, the more important thing in terms of the natural environment is that if you really love nature, then perhaps you should not try to live in it. And that if you want to go camping, wouldn't it be a lot better to be able to leave a city and get out into true wilderness, true nature, rather than having to move through concentric circles of suburbia in order to get to actual nature? And this diagram on the right, while it really does not exist in this country, there's a couple of exceptions, it does exist in other places. Hong Kong, the most environmentally conscientious place on the planet. The average Hong Kong resident actually uses less carbon than any place else in the world because of the density and the mass transit with which they live. Hong Kong uses a third of Hong Kong Island as development, and the other 2/3 is actually natural landscape. It's a city of hikers. And so this is not just some pie in the sky image, it's actually a real possibility. Next, please. And so what we're finding is that if this was the 20th century model of moving from the single family home to the office park, that increasingly people are gravitating towards this model of living in denser circumstances, using mass transit, and finding that they can therefore save time, that they don't have to experience drinking while driving or road rage or texting while driving. Texting while driving constitutes a third of US auto accidents today. Driving is still the most unsafe thing that we do actually as a society. The #1 cause of infant mortality worldwide is automobile accidents. It's not AIDS or malaria. And so how one lives has a dramatic public health effect. And what a lot of people in the country today are starting to understand, and you can page through the book, there's a whole chapter on public health, right? That divorce rates, that obesity rates, there's a whole number of things that improve with denser living. And one of the ways in which we're really starting to understand this now is the choices that millennials are making. I've actually, since the book came out, I've had the sort of privilege of going to a lot of places around the country. What I'm talking about is not just a phenomena that's sort of New York and San Francisco. The country, the heartland, I've always hated that term, but the heartland of the country is urbanizing at a very rapid rate. There was an article in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago about the fact that the people who are aged 25 to 34, that the number of them that live within a 3-mile radius of a city center has increased by 37% since the year 2000. We are seeing a massive uptick of urbanization across the country. And when those young people are finding the New Yorks and San Franciscos too expensive to live in, they are essentially kind of doing a new form of urban homesteading in places like Kansas City and St. Louis and Detroit. Next slide, please. And what that is doing, of course, is it's putting a lot of pressure, economic pressure, on our cities. What this is a fairly new graph that was done by an economist at Market Urbanism. What we're finding is that as walk scores are increasing, and I assume most of you know what walk score is, right? That as you have more walkable neighborhoods, that housing prices are increasing. And of course, it stands to reason. People like living in walkable neighborhoods. They don't want to spend their time to get a quart of milk in a car for an hour, right? And so what you're seeing is in municipality after municipality, housing demand go up in more walkable neighborhoods, and as a consequence, in some places, affordability issues, and in some places like New York and San Francisco, an out-and-out affordability crisis. Because, I mean, I was with the mayor of Portland a couple of weeks ago. So here's an interesting situation. You've got a popular town, a place that a lot of people want to live. They have a very well-known urban growth boundary. You have a lot of incoming population. And it's interesting, the Northwest is considered Portland and Seattle are preparing for what they call climate refugees, because it's supposedly in 50 years going to be the nicest place to live in the country in terms of the climate. So here you have a situation where a lot of Portlanders, they don't want tall buildings. They don't want tall buildings. They have an urban growth boundary. You have a lot of population coming in. You know what that creates? An unaffordable city, which is exactly what San Francisco has done to itself. If you read about San Francisco and the issues of affordability in San Francisco, this is what happens when a marketplace makes it so hard to build new housing, and that you have that many people, and there, of course, you have tech workers who now want to live in the city instead of Silicon Valley like they used to. You then have a tremendous affordability crisis. And so this is an enormous problem in our country. Next slide, please. And I think that what it really means is that not only do we have to, William talks about amalgamated all the time, and it's so important that we've stopped a conversation about public housing in this country. I mean, we had something called public housing. We somehow convinced ourselves, and as architects, fascinatingly, convinced ourselves that this model no longer worked. You know, how many of you have seen the picture of Pruitt-Igoe being blown up? I would hope the majority of you, I would say probably the majority of you have seen, right? This is a form of propaganda. We have actually allowed ourselves to believe that it was the architecture of public housing that caused its failure. Public housing failed because we stopped investing in it. There's Tower in the Park housing projects that, you know, we can show you down the street that are extraordinarily successful. Just walk down to Penn South, right? It is not the architecture. So, you know, we actually stopped creating the kind of housing that, you know, since the end of the 19th century, we've recognized that we needed after the Industrial Revolution for working class people. In '86, under Ronald Reagan, we had this thing called tax credit reform, and now we build this thing we call affordable housing, right, which is this very challenging structure in my mind. But it has some benefits too, which I'll talk about in a second. What we've also stopped building is the infrastructure we need to support new neighborhoods in which we can grow. And so we rely on 100-year-old mass transportation systems that our predecessors built. And so it's very hard to create new neighborhoods that are accessible without that investment in infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I don't actually just mean traditional infrastructure in terms of transit and sewage and water and power, but what I like to call an infrastructure of opportunity in terms of schools and parks, cultural facilities, healthcare, the things that create social mobility in society. Next slide, please. And we've not only done that here, we've actually actively exported it to the rest of the world. And what I find very, very concerning is up at Columbia, I'm sure at NYIT, just about every school in the country talks about this idea that the world is now more urban than it is rural, right? Somewhere around 2007, there was supposedly this inflection point where now more people live in cities than in rural areas. The problem is that there's very little specificity given to the definition of those words. And what I really find is that the world is not so much urbanizing, the world is suburbanizing. The world is suburbanizing at a rate that should scare the bejesus out of you, because it's a simple problem. We have some 2 billion of 7 billion of us headed towards middle and upper middle class lifestyles around the world. Whether you look at Brazil, India, China, Vietnam, you can go down the list. And where at one level, that's very good. Worldwide poverty, the number of people living on $1 a day since 1990 has plummeted. And that's a great thing. The problem is as those people move into the middle class, they want everything that we've become accustomed to having. And where that has centered is the idea that people who achieve a certain amount of social mobility want a single family house and 2 cars and a big television set. And so one of the scariest things I ever did is I took a low-flying flight around Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. And there, out in the desert, right, They were building subdivisions, irrigated, just like you see outside of Phoenix and outside of Sacramento and outside of Las Vegas. So think about what it means for 2 billion, potentially by mid-century, 3 billion people to want those resource-intensive lifestyles that we've really kind of propagated here in the West. This, to me, is much scarier than Ebola. Next slide. And what's interesting is people, I think, and I find this unfortunately true here in the US, tend to paint that whole dilemma as a population crisis. I remember reading an article in the New Yorker, kind of a hand-wringing about the 7 billionth baby born somewhere in either India or Africa. You know, we don't, as a species, have a very good track record with wishing people away. There are 7 billion people on the planet. Population rates are probably going to stabilize by the end of this century, and we'll probably end up with some 10 billion people on the planet. I don't think any of us have the right to say, well, that's too many people, right? I think what we have to think about is how are those 10 billion people going to use the limited resources that we have on the planet in a wise way? And what's interesting to me is, so William mentioned this term hyperdensity that I use in the book. What I mean by that is, you know, I really struggled with, if you're going to write a book about cities, well, you have to, I think it's incumbent upon the author to define what they mean by city. And what I kept coming back to was a place that's dense enough to support mass transit. And so as I started digging into that research, it's actually fairly well understood research that you need about 30 units an acre, or by New York parlance, about 5 to 6 FAR, right, to support mass transit. Meaning, if you build a light rail system and you don't have that much density, you're going to have an empty light rail system. And so understanding by that metric, and that's, by the way, not skyscraper density. That is the density of the West Village, Brownstone, Brooklyn, many very pleasant parts of many cities across the country. But at that density, all 7 billion of us would fit in the state of Texas, leaving the rest of the planet for nature and agriculture. Now, by suggesting this, I am not saying that we should all move to Texas, but I am simply stating, although Texas is densifying and urbanizing in very interesting ways right now, but what I'm actually saying is that there isn't a population crisis, there's a crisis of the imagination. Next slide, please. We don't all live in Texas. We live across the planet in an extraordinarily sprawling way. We use much, much more land than we need to use. And I believe that this, along with water, are going to be the next crises as we really think about all of these people inhabiting the planet. And so, you know, fundamentally, what the book is about is this notion that as that kind of growth takes place, that we need to figure out denser, smarter, greener ways to live as a society. And part of why the book so focuses on the United States is because, like it or not, I still believe the US is a central arbiter of culture worldwide. That our idea of the American dream, which actually got skewed into a consumerist idea, but our idea of the American dream is still very much propagated around the world. And I believe that if this country started down a different path in terms of a more urban path, that much of the rest of the world would actually follow suit, especially as I start to see mayors around the world interacting and enacting policies because all of our national governments are so frozen and sclerotic. Next slide, please. Now, but the problem with that message, I've discovered, is that you can talk to people and you can show them all sorts of data about how social prosperity, environmental sustainability, social mobility, all of that improves with denser urban living. The problem, though, is that for most normal people who don't live in this world of architecture and urbanism, what I find is that most people are actually overwhelmed by that thought. And that, in fact, people are overwhelmed generally. And so one of the things as I sort of pivot into architecture here is that what I find is these are images of various cities with just 3 minutes worth of Twitter usage. Quite intense. So what I'm going to sort of posit, next slide please. What I'm going to posit is that we don't necessarily live in a more complex time than any other time in human history, but we have a window, primarily because of technology, we have a window into the complexity of our world that no people have ever confronted before. And that complexity, I mean, how many of you open the newspaper in the morning, go on a website, and don't feel absolutely overwhelmed by what you read is happening internationally, in science, in terms of worldwide strife, but also in terms of the lens that technology gives us into the world. This is an image from 2012. It's our first known picture of the universe, and it actually shows the ways in which the universe is expanding. Or the next image, please. This is an image of the internet, and it's actually geographic. So the red is Asia, the blue is the Americas, the green is Europe. I love this. The white is unknown, but those are internet server downloads from around the world. Next, please. Or going completely internal to one of the greatest mysteries of all, the human genome. Then the fact that we can track complexity inside of our own bodies in a way that we never could before. Next, please. Or Obamacare, love it or hate it, it's pretty complex, and it's, again, one of these ways in which people kind of feel inundated by a sense of not understanding what's going to happen in their own lives. Next, please. Or ISIS troop movements. Next. Or this image, which is, many of you will recognize, is a section of Kowloon walled city, the densest structure ever made by humankind. And so this is, I fear, when you talk to people about density and this notion that cities have these benefits, that often this is what people conjure, right? That this is what they're scared of. Next, please. And yet, what's interesting about the central messages of density is that it's not just about living in Hong Kong. This is an image that I took outside of Narita Airport, flying out of Tokyo. This is a fairly typical Japanese farming village. It's actually very similar to the village that my father was born in India. And what you'll notice immediately is that even though most farmers around the world live like this, that this is, of course, quite different from the way farmers here live, right? And how is that? Why is that true? Well, you'll notice that these farmers live along a spine. They live together in a village as a community. And if you think about infrastructure, well, think about what it takes to deliver sewage or water or electricity to each farmhouse. It's a fairly straightforward matter. You have a trunk line and everyone kind of feeds off that trunk line. Now think about how we set up our agrarian lifestyle, which with each farmer out on their own plot, right, according to the Jeffersonian grid, right, with this madness that we are supposed to occupy the entire landscape. And you think about the difficulties then of providing sewage, water, electricity, not to mention the communitarian nature of this versus the very socially isolated nature of people living out on those individual houses. So the message of this is that what I'm talking about can extend across every scale of human habitation, from the village to the small town to the big city. Next, please. And so again, people have stereotypes, whether it's the wall buildings of Hong Kong, or what I'm starting to understand at a global level, this is Sao Paulo and the traffic of Sao Paulo, that there are cities being built around the world that actually aren't cities by the descriptors used in the book. What they actually are vertical suburbs. They look like cities, they've got tall buildings in them, but they're actually extraordinarily auto-oriented, and so they're sort of cul-de-sacs turned on their side, if you will. Next, please. And so what I've come to understand that as architects, we play a very central role in this whole dilemma. And by that, what I mean is that even if you believe what I'm telling you, that cities have these extraordinary benefits and advantages, that how then do people, feel comfortable with the idea of that future? And I actually think in order to make that leap, that as architects we have to cross the bridge to the B word, the word that you're not supposed to use in school, which is the word beauty. And we've been struggling with this a lot at CHOP. And one of the things that we've sort of come around to is this idea that beauty under these circumstances, in these conditions, in these very complex conditions, is essentially the imprint of human activity, our fingerprint, if you will, where you really understand the way in which a human being occupies the anonymous vastness of our times. That overwhelming complexity that I just talked about, that architecture has an ability to actually give us access into that world. Next, please. And so in our work, we try to celebrate complexity. We try not to be reductive about it. I did a lot of photography when I was younger, and there's a very influential essay I read by John Sarkowski about this notion that photography was both a window and a mirror. And I very much like to think about our work this way, that it is both a window into the world that we live in, as well as a mirror back into our own humanity. Next. And what's challenging about this is that we've gone through an extraordinary 250-year period. This is one of my favorite paintings, 1784, Oath of the Horatii by David, and in my mind, the sort of beginning of the neoclassical period, but not just in terms of art history, but this is 1784, mind you, 5 years before the French Revolution. David actually calling up these Greek allegories as a way to foment the revolution. And this notion that we would come under this new order of liberté, fraternité, égalité. And so this idea that ultimately, drove social consciousness worldwide for 200 years. As an art history person, I could draw a direct line from this to Rothko. But then, next please. Then of course, we get to the 1960s. And we have a very, very necessary upheaval of that social order that had been intact for some 200 years. And a questioning of that. And as architects, as much as it was necessary to question all the rigid orthodoxies that came before that period, that by the time you get to 66 in Venturi, that we are ultimately left out in the woods. And we have this extraordinarily difficult kind of world to navigate in terms of how does one think about ideas like beauty. Next, please. And so we've actually been rereading this book. It's a very interesting book. But we're much more enamored of the idea of complexity than we are of contradiction. We don't believe that we live in a time that is so much about celebrating irony. Next. And so we've been thinking about more of that. And then next, please. And then even this, which is a kind of new idea for us, that if you could mix that understanding that Venturi was trying to get to about complexity, but make it more about the times in which we live. And everyone from Mies to Frank Gehry has talked about the importance of an architect understanding the times in which they live. But then apply it with the same sense of social conviction that went back to the early modernists and drove some of their kind of almost monastic belief in what they were doing, that you might actually have something. Next, please. And what that has then led us to is that to deal with all of that complexity, that this idea of architect as Superman, emphasis on man, is really a dead idea. That this notion of the lone superhero can't possibly tackle the complexity of everything that we just talked about. And so instead of Superman, next please, we like the idea of the Avengers. Right? Because what are the Avengers? I mean, I have 6 partners. We're a bunch of crazy misfits, right? But you each bring the power you bring to the table, and you try to make something better out of it, right? As a group. And then next, please. And then you start to understand that it's not just about those few, but I mean, this could be a picture of my office, you know, and that you realize to deal with the problems that we have in the world today and somehow be architects that actually have some agency in that world, that you don't just need architecture. Everyone's pretty much an architect in our office, but they're also the biologist, the poet, the chef, the engineer. And that without that sense of interdisciplinarity at a cross-cutting horizontal kind of way, that we're simply not going to get at the problems that we're trying to get at. Next, please. So that's a real picture of our office. Very different, I think, than most offices that you would visit, especially the very noticeable lack of white men in charge. Next, please. And we walk through the Woolworth building every day, which has this sort of neoclassical sense of order, but at the same time, to us is very, very telling of the future. Next, please. In the sense that one of the things that I think has become very important in our work is that, you know, we've traditionally been told to think about cities in this hub and spoke kind of way, that we all come in to this central place to work, and then we go out to our bedroom communities at the end of the day. Next. And yet, when we're in Lower Manhattan, and I think about Lower Manhattan, or where my family and I live in the Flatiron, or Domino, which we'll talk about in a second, what I'm starting to see emerge both here and a lot of other places is this idea of the network city, where people live, work, and play in nodes across the city. And that, you know, we really need to stop thinking about this idea of a central business district. It's actually not the way in which the future of the workspace will take hold. We did a study up at Columbia. 85% of our new tech jobs, some 300,000 jobs in the city of New York, are in pre-war buildings. 70% are in landmarks. Our office in a landmark in the Woolworth building, we would never, even if we could afford it, we wouldn't want to be in a glass office building in Midtown. Next, please. And we've started to notice something because we have a number of projects along the East River, which I've started to call Central River, for this very reason that it's, you know, we used to think of the river as the edge of our city. It's become the center of our city. There's some 47 million square feet of development planned along the river, mainly on the Brooklyn and Queens side. Extraordinary proposals out there, not just for ferry systems, but for tramways, a Brooklyn-Queens light rail. And I think it's really important to understand that we today have people who live in Brooklyn, work in Brooklyn, and come to Manhattan once every 6 months. That was unthinkable 10 years ago. And it tells you something about the future of urbanization that's very, very important. So just by comparison, this is Central Park in scale on that map. Central Park has, in the first couple of blocks around it, some 55 million square feet of development. And so we are really talking about a new era in New York City that is comparable to the development of the park in terms of what's happening along the river. And so we have a number of projects along the river that I'm going to just show you to try to put a little bit more flesh on the bones here. Next, please. Now, what's interesting about waterfront development, and again, going back to the complexity, is one of our first projects is the East River waterfront, which was a public space being built along the water. And this is the linguini of regulatory agencies that we had to deal with to get at some of the fundamental problems. And this is, again, fundamental to our office is the fact that we have people who speak different languages. So I like to kid that one of the languages we speak at SHOP is we speak government, which is a very, very different thing than speaking to someone who wants to build a beautiful single-family house out in New Hampshire somewhere. It's a completely different ballgame. Next, please. And so this was after 9/11. It was about rebuilding all of these broken links from the city back to the river. Next. And basically trying to inhabit the underbelly of the FDR and getting people out to the river. Next. And I'm sure some of you have been there. The bar stools are very popular. Next. Beautiful landscape that's growing in by Ken Smith. This flooded, by the way, during Sandy. It did very well during Sandy. And it's very important, and a lot of these waterfront projects I'm going to show you have that issue in front of them. Next. And then out to Pier 15, which is a double-decker public space. You can't shade the river very easily, and so the idea was to actually get twice the amount of public space by creating a two-tiered park. Next. And, you know, still always with this idea of complexity in terms of how it's crafted, even on a city budget. Next. And if you've been there, the way this slatting system works, again, I think very important in terms of understanding the complexity by which it was built. Next. And then right next door, Pier 15, the renovation of the old Rouse Mall. Next. Which had a very internalized feeling, which was astonishing given its environment. And so we're completely redoing that facility as well. Next. And opening it up, giving it a much more complex read at the base. Next. So that, well, one of the things we're able to do is these are these big glass leaves that will come up and down during good weather, so that it doesn't feel like an enclosed shopping experience, but in fact is something very open. Next. And gives you that big read of the waterfront and the Brooklyn Bridge. And gives you a strong sense of publicness along the water's edge. Next. And then moving over to Seward Park, which is nearby, and William mentioned, this is an extraordinary site. This is 50% affordable housing as well as a senior housing complex. What was tough about this is we went in with a group of very well-known affordable housing developers. The zoning was already predetermined, so there's very little we could do architecturally to the masses. And in fact, we're not designing most of these buildings. We're designing the Andy Warhol museum, which I'd love to show you, but I can't. But we did do the master plan, and the thing we really wanted is to, again, kind of reveal the layers and the complexity of this neighborhood. And one of the things that we saw as a real opportunity is Essex Street Market, the food market, is moving to this site. It's moving just a couple of blocks down from its current location, along where the subway is. And we realized that along the south edge, that on the Broome Street edge, that we could create from the subway and through that market a big light scoop that would bring light down from the south, still allow local retail to face Broome Street, but create a new kind of almost Chelsea Market kind of experience, so that there'd be this hierarchy between a finer grain of retail on Broome versus the kind of bigger stuff that faces Delancey. Next, please. And so that's a sketch of that light scoop that shows this notion that light would come down into the subway layer, and that there'd be winter gardens above, and then local retail below. And so again, I'm trying to show you in very concrete terms how it is one can talk to communities, because we do a great deal of that, in terms of how to talk about the idea that density can be a positive thing. Next. And so that's a rendering of that light scoop. This is the subway level. So that's the retail facing out, the winter gardens above. And then we're just developing this tiling system now, which is a kind of, it's a kind of complex, slightly different version of a Guastavino kind of tile. Next. And then across the Williamsburg Bridge, the Domino project, which I'm sure many of you have read about, on the Williamsburg waterfront. To me, this project in many ways encapsulates almost everything that we're talking about here. Next. It sits at this very interesting bend in the river. And so what happened with this site is there was a 7-year battle to rezone the old Domino Sugar refinery, which sits in the middle. This was landmarked. And there was a 7-year battle by the previous landowner, CPC, to rezone this site for 3 million square feet of development. They got it approved in 2010. The plan was quite kind of blocky and rigid. It came very close to the water's edge. In fact, it came into the floodplain. There was this thin little piece of public space that was supposedly public, but actually the buildings came crashing right down on it. And what happened is CPC, the landowner, which had bought the land for $50 million, sold it to the Willentis family for $184 million after they got it entitled. The Willentises came to us. Jed, who's really the person who runs the company now, is about 38 years old, or was 38 at the time, it was a couple of years ago. And he said, listen, we can build this plan, we'll make plenty of money. I don't want to spend the next 7 years of my life building this plan, we hate it. And so you've got a month, prove to us that we should, these are not words you often hear, go through public approvals again to change the plan. And so next, please. So we actually thought that you could do a couple of things, that if you made the buildings taller and actually didn't build on one of the sites, that you could actually free up a lot of the ground plane. Next, that you could bring River Street, which is an existing street, through the site and connect up the street grid, which were before terminating in a series of cul-de-sacs, and do this funny thing that streets do in this kinds of circumstance, which is actually to make the public space public. If you go to Battery Park City, you'll notice this. The south part of Battery Park City, the buildings come crashing right down onto the open space. The north part, a road separates the buildings from the public space, and the public space feels more public as a consequence. So we very much wanted people to walk down these streets from the neighborhood and be able to get to this open space, which is about 6.5 acres of open space. Next. And then we had this idea in terms of the master planning, which is that these are big buildings. Everyone in the neighborhood, we actually got a 29-3 vote in favor of the plan from the community. Everyone in the community understood these were going to be big buildings, but that we could aerate the buildings and get light and air back into the neighborhood. Next, please. And that also that each building, and we're designing 2 of the 4, and we did that very purposefully. We said as a rule that it would be bad urbanism for us to design all of these buildings, and actually set a rule that no 2 shop buildings could be adjacent to each other. And so we're designing these 2 and have done the design guidelines for the other 2, but other architects will come and build those. But the idea is that every building has quite low scale elements, because that part of Williamsburg actually has buildings that are 40 to 60 feet high. And then, next please. Mid-range elements that are at the refinery or bridge height. And then next, please. And then skyline elements. And this was a very interesting conversation to have with the sort of new Brooklyn. This site sits at the midway point of the East River. And we made an argument that just like Manhattan has this tremendous parabola kind of at its center, that Brooklyn should have something celebratory at its center in terms of its skyline that shouldn't be Manhattan, but that should be something that's very specific to Brooklyn. Next, please. And so, whereas these buildings aren't designed yet, it was very important through the master planning phase that people in Williamsburg, this creative community, didn't want all glass buildings. They wanted buildings that had a lot of materiality, and in fact, we just finished the DD set on this building, which has actually the highest concentration of affordable housing in it. It also has a community center, but it's a very beautiful building. It has copper at the base and zinc at the top, and the copper's meant to patina and age over time. But to me, one of the most important elements is a non-architectural element, which is the program. Because what was different about this proposal is this building, the refinery, as well as this building, are being converted into tech office space. And so it's not just, when Jane Jacobs talked about mixed use, she didn't mean housing with a Dwayne Reed on the bottom. And so this notion that actually there's 600,000 square feet of office space, and also, and it's interesting because the Willentises operate Dumbo, and there also, it's almost all independent retailers. So there's not going to be any chain stores or big box. Next, because this notion of, sorry, can you go back one and then I'll come back, sorry. How these buildings meet the street was a very interesting conversation. And again, this goes back to all of what we just talked about in terms of convincing people that cities and dense living is actually a positive thing. This building, so we're designing these 2 buildings. This building, affectionately known as the Donut. A lot of people have made comparisons to CCTV or La Défense. I find those comparisons frustrating because, again, now next, please. Because if you've been to the base of CCTV or La Défense, you will find very, very repellent conditions for the pedestrian. Whereas these buildings try to meet the street very responsibly. The donut, this is actually the base of the donut, has a school at its bottom. And again, this notion of independent retail and a much smaller grain of retail as it meets Kent is very important. And so that's something that was a real watchword for us. And then next, and then the design of this park, this is designed by field operations with the notion that and I actually really do believe in preservation for buildings that deserve to be preserved, and the refinery is certainly one of those. In the previous plan, there's a building here. And so the refinery was really conceptualized as this thing you saw from Manhattan, almost like this two-dimensional piece of pastiche, as opposed to this notion by pushing this building back, what you really get is you get the experience of that refinery in its full volume. But you also have an immediate understanding, so there's a piece of hardscape that's going to sit right outside of that refinery, that's the center, that it's kind of the nerve center of this new place. And people are going to, we talked about the infrastructure of opportunity, this notion that we don't need to build a new subway line to this place. We don't have billions of dollars to spend on it. But the idea that people can walk and bike to this place and that they don't necessarily have to get onto a crowded L train every day to get into Manhattan, that was very, very appealing to this community. And so to me, again, this is why this is such an important project looking forward for that whole string of development that's going to take place along the river. Next, please. And the fact that this is, again, the skyline, there's still a lot of design work to do, but I think quite an impactful piece. And again, this was interesting. So these buildings went from a 400-foot cap where, I mean, if you look along the Brooklyn-Queens waterfront, you see an enormous amount of monotony that's emerged. A lot of that is because of the rigidity of the zoning. And the notion that instead you would have more of a high-low city is something that I actually think was quite important. Next. How are we doing time-wise? Not too bad. Actually,
We started late, so.
so when do you go till? Okay, actually, I want to skip through this. This is Melbourne, which I thought I had hid these slides. Next, next, same principle. Open space height, next, next. Okay, towers. I actually don't think you can really talk about this subject without sort of dealing with the 800-pound gorilla, right? And it's interesting to me because how many, for the students, I'm really curious. How many of you had a studio where you got assigned a tower? Yeah, hard to find in almost any architecture school in the country. And I find this astonishing. They're really hard, by the way. And as we've started getting into the work of doing towers, we've said to ourselves, well, are they just plain old bad? Is that why we don't get to design them in school? But this is New York City. We live in New York City. I mean, there are skyscrapers that people absolutely love in the city. So one of the things we've started thinking about is, well, what do people love about them? Right? And how is it that our early notions of the skyscraper that came out of zoning that resulted in this setback form, how has that kind of manifest itself in the imagination of New Yorkers? Next. And we've started thinking about the fact that even though towers have an extraordinary amount of kind of technicality that drives them in terms of program and elevator and structure and mechanical systems, that there's also ways in which you can start to build an accretive layer around towers that actually makes them less kind of difficult for human beings to scale against. Next. And so we've really started to think about how does one reinterpret for the 21st century the idea of the New York skyscraper. Next, please. And so we got an assignment very close to here. This is the Steinway building. It's designed by Warren and Wetmore. It's a landmark. We had a client come to us, very narrow site right next door. This is under construction, who wanted to build a very, very tall tower. And it had to go through landmarks approval and community board approval. So only the foundations are going on right now. And we took a very careful look at the Steinway building. Next, please. And tried to understand what it would mean to design a 1,400-foot tall tower, a tower taller than the Empire State Building on this site. And how could it possibly be worthy of the New York skyline? And one of our first understandings was that there was a setback set of requirements through zoning, but that maybe actually we should amplify that idea into this idea of these sort of feathered setbacks. Next, please. And had this crazy thought that maybe, just maybe, the apartment units should have something to do with the architecture and the structure of the building, which is very unheard of, with a very clear understanding of served and servant spaces. This is part of our unaffordable housing portfolio. I'll show you some of the others in a second. But going back to where we started this lecture, I have no problem with this, and I'll tell you why I have no problem with it. I would much rather have these people living in this apartment, which will probably cost $35 or $40 million, than them living in an 18,000 square foot house in Greenwich, Connecticut with 8 cars. One of the most fundamental things, and it's interesting, if I go abroad, this becomes so clear. We still live in a city where an executive and a custodian takes the same subway to work every day. We're hanging on to that by a thread, just by a thread. But it still exists in our city. It is a gift. Most places in the world will never have this because of the amount of social stratification there is. And I believe it's fundamental to the social fabric. So I have actually no problem with this, and I actually think it's going to be quite a beautiful piece. The idea is one will come out of their elevator, see the park on one side and the city in the other, in a sort of very transparent manner, and then very serious shear walls holding up the building and giving it lateral stability on the east and west facades. Next, please. So that's that structural diagram. This will be one of the most slender buildings in the world. It's a 1:23 aspect ratio. And that also was very interesting to us because, again, looking back in the history of New York skyscrapers and thinking about the New York skyscrapers that people truly love, and I don't just mean architects, but normal people, the Chrysler Building, One Wall Street, the Woolworth Building, they all share certain characteristics in common. They're slender, they have setbacks, they have a material presence, they have something special happening at the top. What's interesting to us about all of that is how can one reinterpret that? And the other thing that's interesting is that office buildings, fundamentally because they need such large floor plates, can't achieve that slenderness. And so it's really the new residential spires that are going to take that on. And they're going to take that on either in a bad way or hopefully in a better way. So next, please. So these shear walls to us gave us a material opportunity. And what you'll find in all of our work, we have nothing against glass, but you'll find in almost all of our work a very strong material presence. Metals, stones, and again, for us, going back to that B word, people find a tactility and a simple beauty in relating to a material that we think is extraordinarily important in the times that we live in. Next. And so one of the things we started thinking about is on those shear walls, could there be a patterning that actually gave you a sense of relief in the skyline and a sense that as one moved around the building that the oblique would give you a different experience than, say, the straight-on view with this kind of relief pattern. Next. And this notion that at every setback, it would set off this kind of blaze of pattern. There's another building here that I had my staff Photoshop out. Next. And so this facade on the east and the west is an 18-inch thick terracotta and bronze facade. It's quite heavy. The terracotta is coming from Germany. I think it's going to be very, very beautiful. But what's interesting, terracotta, very, very classic, historic New York material, being used in a very contemporary way through technology. There's about 23 different profiles that are used to warp and weft up the building to get that sense of oblique and to get that sense of depth and richness. Next, please. And we've actually started to develop, now I'm going to use the O word, a pretty strong sense of ornament around that underlayer. Because again, I think buildings at this scale demand that as you get closer to it, that you read layer upon layer of detail. Next. And for us, and this is one of my, I actually really love this image of the building because it's actually not an image of the building, it's an argument. I had a great professor once who taught me that every drawing that you do is an argument for something. And this is an argument about how this building relates to the mass of our city. And so fundamentally we believe, whether this building is a success or a failure, that it is born out of the DNA of New York, that it is of, by, and for this place and this place alone. It can't be in Dubai or Shanghai or Mumbai. It is specific. Which doesn't, by the way, mean that it's historicist or contextual. It's just specific. Next. We're working on the top of the building. Light will come through into Central Park next. And it is a tall building, a tall and thin one. So we'll see. Next. Just like the way the airbag started in luxury vehicles and then made its way to every other car, we have, with that kind of a project, then learned things in terms of the application of technology to other projects. So this is a 900-unit affordable housing project, 50-50. This is what's known as a 50-30-20, again, from the '86 tax reform. But then Sean Donovan, when he was housing commissioner, created this thing called the New Hop program, which basically allows for subsidization for 20% very low income, 30% middle income, 50% market rate, but market rate for this neighborhood, which is in Long Island City. So these buildings are going up right now. Next, please. Strong sense of detailing, again. Again with layers of kind of complexity that change the way one reads the building as one moves around it. Next. But quite honestly, it's very tough. I mean, this is before that next layer comes on, but getting the right detailing on affordable housing projects has proven to be a real challenge, but we're trying. Next. And we're trying to also apply that kind of technology in lots of different places. This is in Botswana. I showed that Australia project, which I didn't show you. One of the things, you know, it used to be that architects had rules like, I don't want to work for a developer. I have a different rule. I don't want to work for a sheikh in the Middle East. I don't care, you know, what Pritzker Prize winner goes off and builds a piece of frozen yogurt in the desert. We're not going to build in places that use slave labor, fundamentally. And so we're in Botswana right now. There's actually a great tech transfer. This project's under construction. This is a tech hub. There's a great technology transfer program that's happening with the laborers on the site. We're working in Australia. We're working in a couple of other places. But we just really have no interest in working in places that have very suspect labor conditions. And one of the things about that, by the way, is then to get this kind of architecture, you really have to think about it. It's not just because some laborer is making 10 cents an hour and so you can afford to build that there because you can't build it in New York or London. Next, please. This is a different kind of a preservation project. This is built around 200-year-old trees that sit in the dune. This is going to be the center of a new technology city in Botswana. Botswana is an amazing country. It found its diamond wealth after the colonists left, so it's actually been able to control its fate in a different way. Next. But I wanted to show you this because, again, this use of technology, extraordinary basket weaving tradition. The baskets have such geometric complexity next, that we actually ended up mapping the patterns, next, and taking those patterns and applying them in some of the public spaces of the building, next, but doing that through a grasshopper program, because there was no way to deploy those patterns simply by drawing it. That's how complex they were. And for us, what's important about that is, again, going back to this complexity issue, that technology isn't about celebrating technology. Technology should be about celebrating humanity. Next. And so we're using that technology in other ways. We've actually just had a breakthrough after a little bit of a glitch on this, but out at Atlantic Yards with Modular, which I'm sure many of you have read about. So this idea of a steel frame, and next. And then modules that are built in the Brooklyn Navy Yard with union labor come by truck, next. And of course, you don't understand necessarily, you'll be living in modular housing, but we really believe that this is the wave of the future. Like I said, there's just a recent breakthrough on this, so we're very excited that this is going to move ahead. Next. And this notion of, again, the specificity of place, that there's a pride of place in terms of how we try to do things. That, again, we try to, in this very anonymous time we live in, find that specificity and link people back to it. Next. And then I'm just going to close by talking about the Barclays Center, because to me it very much encapsulates most of these ideas of reading what is a very specific place and its materiality. Next. And this idea that one could, this is still, other than Madison Square Garden, the only arena that I know of in the world that exists without a parking space, with 11 transit lines, and really not just being transit-oriented, but celebrating the transit, which I'll talk about in a second, as well as, again, this read of the place in terms of the core 10 and how it relates to Brownstone Brooklyn. Next. With this idea, and if people have questions about the whole Frank Gehry period, I can answer those questions. But basically, this notion that through this double helix skin, that we could open up the arena and make it urban, both at the ground plane, where one can look in and see retail or practice courts or whatever it is, or from the concourses where one can look out and experience the city. Next. And then this very important entry plaza and this condition of this oculus and this cantilever coming out to meet the transit. Next. And so that as one comes through the transit, one's immediately engaged by this architectural moment and understands, you know, the relationship, again, back to nature. Next. But then maybe even just as important, the relationship to the scoreboard, because after all, if you're running late for the game, what else do you need to know but the score? Next. And so, you know, the way in which this building is really designed is that we tried to take what's fundamentally theater without a known ending, sports, and make everything about that stage. And so if you walk through the Barclays Center, you'll notice that there isn't a single colorful chair. Everything is very muted. It's almost like black box theater, with all of the focus placed on the central action. Next. As true for the Nets as it is for Beyonce, or next, Jay-Z on his opening night. This is, of course, the house of Jay-Z. He talked about the fact that he grew up in a public housing project just blocks away. Again, a kind of sense of specificity. Next. Or this is just gratuitous, but why not? Next. And then down to the detail of every light fixture, again, celebrating a sense of kind of complexity. Next. And then the technology that was used to do it, this was done in a CATIA model using aerospace technology. Next. But again, not to celebrate the technology itself, but to really create this read of the high-low city and an interpretation of context, not a literal transposition of it. Next. And there's that double helix again, just to show you the kind of way in which that rain screen goes on the volume. Next. And the fact that those panels they went directly from our computers to the fabricator without shop drawings. And again, not every project's getting built this way. We wish more projects had this kind of logic and had clients that were this forward thinking because of the way in which those 12,000 panels then form that curvilinear form, again, without the use of bad labor conditions or anything else that one uses to build that kind of architecture. Next. That included an iPhone app that we wrote that actually tracked every panel as it arrived from the fabricator to the site. Next. And that's the last stage of the weathering of the Corten steel. Still rusting a little bit, but we think we got most of it out. Next. And the assembly. Next. And then the way that skin reads during the day as this tough, kind of lizard-like exterior. Next, and then how it transforms at night and what it then creates in terms of the environment around it. Next, and then just my last slide. To me, this nexus between architecture and city building is sort of encapsulated in this image. To me, a great urban building is something that's way beyond the building itself. It creates a sense of what I like to call a kind of glue, a kind of global urban ecology, that buildings by themselves are important, but if buildings can actually bring us together as cities and actually celebrate the idea of city living with a sense of civic delight. And that's what's interesting. This project, obviously a very controversial project as it was approved and going through the motions. One of the things that I find really interesting is if you come out of a game or a concert, you see people just walking back into their neighborhoods from the building. And that to me is a sign of how a building can can kind of celebrate urban life and a sense of civic delight. So with that, I'm going to close. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Happy to.
Thank you, Vishaan. That was really inspiring, and both in terms of how you presented how you think, and the information you gave us was vast and important. Are there any questions, please? This is always a slow step.
We got one already.
We need a microphone. Where's the mic, please?
I figured.
Huh?
I don't need a mic.
Well, they need they need to hear you too.
Hello? Okay. Hi, how you doing? My name is Michael.
Hi, Michael.
What was your initial inspiration from trying to transition from suburban design going directly into urbanization? In terms of, understanding the ramifications of mass suburbanism in terms of its, like, I guess you would consider its poison, and then converting it into an urban landscape, which a lot of people would consider the opposite of suburban living. A lot of normal people would say that the urban environment is actually more dangerous. If you kind of
well, yeah. I mean, so look, it's at some level for me, it's a deeply personal issue. I started writing and thinking about the whole suburban-urban divide and kind of what it means for the country almost a decade ago. And so the book has been a project that came through a lot of evolution. A lot of that happened, I was working as an architect, and then 9/11 happened, and I went to work for the city and started to realize the challenges of talking about density and building infrastructure, but also understanding that we were doing something right, that I used to give a lecture called Tenacious Manhattan that was about the rebound of Manhattan after 9/11. And I'm very, very taken with the resilience of cities and the degree to which cities can take extraordinary hits, fires, pestilence, plague, terrorist actions, you name it, riots, and yet come back. I was in Detroit a few months ago, and I'm just amazed at what's happening in the heart of that city. and started to realize that a lot of our failures in this country are not happening actually in our cities, but are actually happening in these environments that were created almost from whole cloth in a very, very short time frame, really over the course of just a few decades. And so decided to write the book, and the book is, William was very kind in the introduction. I mean, the book is almost, in my mind, kind of a children's book because it tries to break down with its graphics for just everyday people to be able to understand what the facts are. And so, yeah, I know there are all these stereotypes about cities being these evil places and all of that stuff, but the facts are incredibly dispositive, whether it's the environmental issues, the economic issues, et cetera. And then what I realized, again, is that, moving back into the practice of architecture, that, so we don't do single-family houses. We've never done a single-family house. We never will. Other people do, and I'm not judging that. But for us, we're interested in doing transit-oriented urban development. And realizing that the big struggles then are to really explain to people what the benefits of this idea are. And so for me, it's just a personal path more than anything else. But I actually think that path has been aided by the fact that the facts are there to back you up. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but
you definitely did. But what kind of details have you looked into for urban design that kind of bring the human connection to nature? Because you did mention that with this mass idea of urbanism, for instance, let's say everybody moved to Texas and then everything was high-rise and we had beautiful landscape around that we could see from our buildings. But where in that is, the human personal connection to nature rather than just being able to see it through a framed window?
Great question. So, look, in my mind, it's really fairly straightforward. I mean, at the level of practice, virtually every building we do has some very important sense of public space associated with it. And we try to do that in that Melbourne project, Domino, every single one. But, I would throw the question back at you and say that a patch of lawn outside of your house is not nature. It's a synthetic idea, right? It's irrigated, it's artificial. If you want to really understand it, to me it's fascinating. So one of the big drivers of this is supposedly child rearing, right? You have a kid needs nature, right? Except you go to most suburban environments and you go to the backyard and you see the rusty swing set. My kids grew up in the city. They went to playgrounds and they understood that space was shared, that that space is a social concept. And that if you really wanted to be in nature, well, that's a different idea. That's about going to a mountain or a canyon or a river. It's not about a patch of grass in the back of your house.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Could we have another question, please? Do we have more questions? Yes, back there.
You've spoken a lot about the growing of urban centers and the sort of migration in that direction. I was just wondering if you've considered the repurposing or revitalizing of the suburban areas, or a way to transition into a new use or approach.
Yeah, it's not directly my field, but my prediction around this is that, so if you look at this region, for instance, that the rail-based suburbs will be fine. Where you'll probably see so take New Jersey. I'm not going to say take New Jersey, please. I know that's a bad, but if you take New Jersey is actually the densest state in the United States. And it's run out of land. And where you're going to see growth in New Jersey and probably Long Island and other parts of the region is right along the train line. And you're going to start to see, and it's already happening in a lot of places, you're going to see multifamily housing development happening in those places. And so if I were just a pure real estate speculator, I would try to like make as many deals with as many transit authorities to develop on their parking lots as I could, because you're going to see a huge amount of growth happening in all of those areas, whether it's Ronkonkoma and Long Island or all up and down the Northeast Corridor in New Jersey. I think those places will by and large fare perfectly well. The places I'm really, really frightened about and about which I have no answer are the crazy, crazy places we built in George W. Bush's America that were fueled by subprime mortgages. They sit in the outskirts of almost every major city, especially in the South and in the West. Poorly built, right, ex-urban development. And what's happening with that development that's really frightening is it is becoming poor. And there's an increasing amount of suburban poverty. There's a great book called The Great Inversion that's about this topic. And about the fact, and you know, it's interesting because a lot of progressive New Yorkers especially don't like to hear this, but the last thing we want to be in this country is like continental Europe. Paris, Barcelona, lovely places. They're also some of the most segregated places on the planet, right? Where very, very wealthy people get to live in what we think of as Paris. What we think of as Paris is about 17% of Paris. Most of Paris lives in its periphery in incredibly adverse social circumstances. And what I'm afraid of, you saw that walk score graph, that's what's starting to emerge as a dynamic in this country, that as the cities are getting repopulated, it's forcing poorer people further and further out. And if it's not those rail-based suburbs, which are still valuable because they're connected to cities, those people are being forced into exurbs. And when that happens, you have generational poverty like you've never seen, because it's expensive to drive, all the kids are in a low-income school, it's a trap. And so to me, this worries me a great deal, and I don't have an easy solution for it, especially because, and I know I'm giving you long-winded answers to these questions, but what's the scariest thing to me about all of that is that it's out of sight, out of mind. You can drive, or take the train 30, 40 miles out into Long Island, and you can experience abject poverty that we never see, that is completely off our radar. And I don't have an easy or a good solution for that, other than to say that we need to densify our cities with more affordable housing. We need to keep that sort of tidal wave demographically from moving out of our cities for a whole host of economic and social reasons.
Let's take a few more questions. Yes, can we get the mic, please, sir? What, sir?
Vishaan, thank you so much.
Sure.
You know, you were showing a slide which was a Japanese village, but you mentioned this was similar to your father's village. What I would like to ask you is to just tell us a little bit more about your father's village and answer another doubt I have in my mind, because you said revolutions is a city thing. You know, if we want to see the revolution, you know, this is happening in the cities, you know, it's concentrated in the city, and this is where it is gonna take place. I wanted to think for a moment about the peasant revolutions or the Naxalites or the Maoist rebels, which are happening all over in the rural areas. We are not paying attention to it, we are ignoring it, but you know, there are killings and bombings, etc. That's also a revolution. So in that context, I would like to, you know, if you can describe your father's village and how it is now.
Sure. I think you have the rest of the audience at a disadvantage. For most people probably don't know what the Naxalite revolution is, but I will say that your question is actually the answer to your question, in the sense that those rural revolutions haven't done terribly well, precisely because, guess what? They're not televised. You know, they're happening out in very rural areas where it's extremely hard, especially in the world we live in today, to get media attention, right? And so a lot of like the Maoist insurgencies in rural India have been taking place much longer than Occupy Wall Street. But Occupy Wall Street gets a lot of attention because of where it is, right? What happened in Tahrir Square got a lot of attention because of where it is. And so I would still argue that cities in the world in which we live are the kind of platform, the kind of hardware platform in which we as software kind of get to change and grow. That's not to deny the importance of what those people are fighting for. I'm just saying that in terms of effectiveness, that you tend to see that happen more on an urban platform than a rural platform. My father's village is in West Bengal, about 12 miles from the Bangladesh border, so I know the revolutions of which you speak pretty well.
Could I have the mic? I have one final question from the dean here, and then we'll retire to the reception. Vishaan, this has been really an enlightening presentation for me for any number of reasons, which I'll have to call you and have lunch over. But what my question is, within your portfolio of interests and project types and your argument, does this include or exclude educational or university typologies?
No, it doesn't exclude it at all. I mean, in terms of that shot, the slide I showed of the river, to me, so for instance, one of the most interesting things that we have to see unfold is this whole effort to get Cornell Technion here, for instance. What kind of impact that's really going to have at an urban scale, because it's an island. And so, you know, I think our great universities are part of their cities, and so that's a real challenge. But I'd also say that, you know, my former dean, Mark Wigley, used to talk about the fact that universities are a much sort of older form of technology than our cities, and they tend to change at a much slower rate, which is maybe both a good thing and a bad thing. This is maybe a little off your question, but I'm a bit worried about the way in which these topics are discussed in schools today. I'm not at all surprised that no one is taught to even challenge what a tower is in school. And that's not a criticism of NYIT. Like I said, it's true in almost every major school in the country. I mean, I find that kind of astonishing, because even if it's a typology that you decide as a student to critique or even loathe, one would think that you would at least have the opportunity to examine it. And I think it doesn't happen for a very specific set of pedagogical and ideological reasons that are kind of, that are divorced from a lot of the questions that I've tried to raise here tonight.
Okay, two things then. Just one, I find it really fascinating because you provoked my mind that when I was at Cornell, I mean, this is a long time ago, it was rather astounding. One of the summer studios was tall buildings. And it was amazing, this was in the late 70s, that they were actually doing that, and everyone wanted to do the tall building. And it is very interesting, it doesn't happen in educational systems. But what your answer was slightly off
Yes, I know,
subject,
I know.
but that's
sorry.
okay. I will only ask one more question. For instance, in places like Ghana, where the housing is so horrid for students in dormitories and university buildings, that kind of project, though it's a university which is not totally urban, but it's urban because it's within, let's say, Accra, let's just talk about Ghana. Those kinds of projects don't fall outside of the definition you have, or do they fall outside of?
Oh, no, not at all, not at all. I mean, I think, universities are clearly part of an urban ecosystem that I didn't, it's interesting because obviously in a lot of places, whether here or abroad, universities are now understood to be the drivers of a lot of urbanity, not just the kind of educators of it. So no, I think it absolutely falls within the larger framework. In trying to talk about urbanization is a big thing to talk about and write about, I found, and that, that for most people who are just part of the lay public, the role of the university is somewhat secondary, I think, in their mind to the sort of basics of how do I get to work? How do I get my kid to school? How do I get my bag of groceries, unless they happen to work at a university? And so that's why I think the way the topic is handled is in a bit more of a general way.
Thank you very much. That was somewhat of a particular question on my part, but I want to thank you very, very much. It was excellent and inspiring, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.